Hi there and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video, and myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to talk you through a few interesting nuggets concerning things that have been taking place in the Ukraine war over the last few days. I'm going to start with what has taken place overnight and the heavy missile attacks that have hit multiple cities around Ukraine. I showed on this morning's update video of the front lines all the places where the Russians hit, and it stretches, those targets stretch from the west of Ukraine over to the east, and it appears in some ways fairly indiscriminate. In other ways, there were a few targets that were of strategic values. But the issue here is that there were also a lot of targets that were not particularly militarily important. And this has incurred the wrath of people worldwide, condemning Putin's decisions, or his forces' decisions, to send missiles into civilian areas. And it has also made people very angry in Ukraine itself, obviously. Now, the situation here is that Putin threatened a harsh response to what he called terrorist attacks, that being the attacks on primarily the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. And it's interesting that he, of course, uses the term terrorist, and then his response is effectively terrorism, inciting terror amongst civilian populations by bombing residential areas. It's rank hypocrisy, of course. Lots of condemnation. There were embassies that were hit. German, although it wasn't being used at the moment, it looks like a Romanian embassy. All sorts of stuff going on. There are some major buildings taken out. This is central Kyiv, where I think this is the possibly the energy, one of the big energy companies that was hit. And you could argue, okay, that's energy infrastructure. Is that a genuine military target? Well, okay. But then there's an awful lot of examples of, civilian areas being hit. Just to let you know, sometimes when you see civilian places like cities and towns in Ukraine being hit by bombs, there are often a lot of blurred out bits to the photos. This is because of the martial law, certain Ukrainian laws that say that you can't show certain parts of videos and pictures because of, and I don't know whether it's sort of operational security or whether it is indeed a kind of hearts and minds thing. And you'll see that in the next video, which is here. So that's why this is blurred, and it's part of the Ukrainian laws. But Russia is a terrorist state, hashtag there. I mean, the idea is that from Russia's point of view, I guess, well, they've got two options, and this is what I was talking about earlier. One, they are trying to hit genuine strategic military targets, but they are using inaccurate missiles. And therefore, they hit places like this. I mean, this landed in the middle of the street, right? So, what's going on there? Okay, it could have been shot down by surface-to-air missile defense and landed there. But essentially, this has hit a residential area. Okay, so the other option is that Russia are intentionally hitting residential areas to cause panic and some kind of petulant retaliation. I mean, petulant's too small a word, really, for when people die. Or the other option is it's just completely random. They're just sending missiles up. I doubt that's the case, but it seems insane. Here is a breakdown of all the places that have been hit. As this tweet says, 20 big Ukrainian cities were targeted with 83 Russian missiles. 83 missiles all over the shop here, from north to south and east to west. It was the largest missile strike day since the beginning of the war. 55% of them were shot down. So just imagine the amount of destruction had those missiles not been shot down. This is not cruise missiles, and not from today and this morning and whatnot and last night. This is actually just an example of the poor maintenance that must be taking place with missiles. So this is an example of a Russian rocket launcher shoving off missiles, and there's a fourth one that then malfunctions, and then just, oh, there it goes, and will crash down obviously near to where it's shot, which will be endangering the lives of the people around there, which is probably somewhere in occupied Donetsk or Luhansk or Zaporizhia. Bang. Not a good look for the Russians, that. Now, the reason I showed that is because the Russians are firing off all these missiles, much bigger missiles, but they're just as equally poorly maintained. And there's evidence that in Belgorod, a cruise missile was shot off and it just came down on top of Belgorod. That was some time back. So this is what the Russians are claiming. They were heralding these, lauding these missiles, being sent off from Russian ships, and this was doing the damage that they did. And they seem to be very proud of that, but this is what they're proud of doing. So this now, before, well, I'll show you this and then just talk about So that was in Dnipro, which is round about there. So that was that explosion there. Okay, the big thing to say is that these attacks, predominantly these attacks took place at rush hour. Why would Russia intend or plan or carry out these strikes at rush hour? Rush hour is when most people are going about their daily business and going to work and being at work. The only reason you would strike at rush hour that I can work out is if you wanted to cause maximum civilian casualties. If you are hitting infrastructure, you're hitting stuff where people are either going to work or where they are at work. It's absolutely unconscionable. This is the Dnipro bus station. It's been hit at rush hour. Hit at rush hour. Insane. Here is another Dnipro hit. I mean, it could be one and the same that we've just seen. But that is, you know, yet another example of terrible, terrible destruction. Okay? It's just not good. This is Kyiv. Not far from the president's house. This is the crater at the playground that I showed in the earlier video today. So that's clearly a civilian structure, and this one is pretty startling. It's just very evocative, really. You can imagine from watching this video how terrifying it must be.
У мене трясуться руки, тому що я щойно побачила, як летить ракета. Я почула це. У мене трясуться руки, тому що я щойно побачила.
War. Absolutely terrible. And what Russia are doing, I just got shivers down my spine there in a bad way, that what Russia is doing is terrible. And I try to be objective and neutral, but it's really difficult to be neutral when Russia are purposefully targeting civilians and infrastructure that is basically civilian infrastructure. If you're taking out water and power to human beings, not to the military, to human beings, and you're saying, oh, we're hitting infrastructure, that is, in my opinion, a war crime. There you go. Absolutely incredible. And that is footage from a thermal power plant in Kyiv, probably the Tripilska thermal power plant. The strike has led to electricity issues in the Ukrainian capital, with some neighbourhoods falling into a blackout. Well, not just there, but there's a thermal power plant in Kryvyi Rih, which is the hometown of, or the home city of, the President Zelensky. So again, energy infrastructure affecting predominantly civilians. But, you know, this is what the Russians think. Here's a typical sort of genocidal claim that you can see on Telegram. If what happened today, I mean the strikes on the Ukraine, so trying to call them Nazis, I think, was a one-time action, and I believe that this was the case, then this will not give the desired effect. In other words, there should be more than one. The infrastructure of the Nazis must be knocked out non-stop for at least a month. When all electrical substations, bridges, communications and other vital infrastructure are destroyed, then we can talk about any significant success. The enemy must lose any opportunity to have access to modern means of transportation and logistics, as well as life in normal, comfortable conditions. Shells should be carried to the front by carts, and wagons should be hauled along the remaining railway tracks by steam locomotives, and electricity and gas should generally become the subject of study only in history textbooks. And that's your typical, and obviously that's not representative of all Russians. This will be the nationalist extreme, but they are cheering on this kind of activity. And when Putin is seeing fractures in and around the Kremlin, and he's thinking, okay, the general public might not be totally up for this war, but I can appease them by either not telling them what's going on exactly, or, you know, sort of ignoring them because they're not going to give me too much hassle. But actually, these nationalistic military bloggers who were completely on my side are now a thorn in my side. So he's trying to appease possibly the more virulent faction that exists in Russia. So yeah, it's and just lastly on this little section before I go to some excerpts from a podcast. Just says, so that Tim White says, Lviv is almost entirely without power after 15 missiles landed in the city during Russia's terrorist attacks. Kharkiv has managed to restore electricity to most regions in the hour. And then this is what I wanted to end on just here. A reminder to anyone, and I have used this term, so yeah. A reminder to anyone posting about Ukraine, particularly journalists, please do not say indiscriminate strikes by Russia. That's just wrong. These are targeted, very discriminate strikes by a terrorist state. That's an interesting position. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. So I want to play you a couple of excerpts from Ukraine the Latest podcast, which is a Daily Telegraph podcast. And I remember listening to it. As soon as this happened overnight, hitting all these targets around Ukraine, I was like, this is Dom Nichols talked about this months ago, and I've just had to do some serious digging around of all the podcasts I've listened to in the last 100 days, and found two parts of where Dom Nichols has talked about this. He's the defence correspondent, used to be in the army himself. He is talking about what is going on in the thought processes of the Russians when they are doing these kind of attacks. And I don't know if you remember, some months back there was an attack on a mall and an attack on Odessa, a bunch of civilian attacks. What the attack on a mall was supposed to be, attack on a nearby-ish or nearby military depot or something, and that's what the Russians claimed. And but it hit this mall, which then caused untold amounts of damage to civilian stuff and killed civilians, right? So, how did they explain this? Well, here's a couple of excerpts. See what you think.
I know, Dominic Nichols, that you have an interview coming up at 12:30. So very quickly, I know you wanted to talk about the idea of precision-guided missiles and weapons in the Ukraine war. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, David. I just wanted to talk about this because people need to understand what precision means and why this attack in Kremenchuk on the Amster shopping centre, why Russia will say it is precise and it was against a legitimate target, and whilst the civilian deaths are regrettable, they are legal. And I just want to explain the parameters of why some of that may be true and some of it may not be true. So let's have a look at precision. The way the military talks about precision when it talks about weapons is it uses this term CEP, circular error probable, and that is a circle around the place you want the round to land, and it could be hundreds of meters. So, for example, these old KH-22 missiles that we think were launched against the Amster shopping centre, they've got a CEP of 300 meters. So put your pin on the target you want to hit, pencil on a bit of string out 300 meters, draw a circle around that, and that is where the weapon can land and still be classified as precise, to have done everything that you expected of the weapon. Now, not many targets are within that kind of zone, and because these are such old weapons, modern weapons like the Caliber missiles that we know Russia have a much smaller CEPs of 50 meters. Some weapons have sort of 1 or 2 meters, so they are very, very precise. But there's 2 points to consider. Firstly, that a weapon landing within its CEP can count as precise, and secondly, it counts as precise if 50% of the weapons fired land in the CEP. The other 50% of weapons can land a meter outside the CEP, 10 meters, or a kilometer. It could go absolutely anywhere. So when we're talking precision missiles, got to be very careful about what we mean. Now, if you look at the
just to pause it there, the idea here is that with these cruise missiles, there's the intention to hit a target, and they are defining precision by 50% of those missiles hitting within 300 meters of that target, because these missiles have a CEP of 300 meters. This particular, the KH-22, other ones are more accurate. And if 50% hit inside that circle, then that's accurate, and 50% can go kind of anywhere else. I mean, is that really precision?
If you look at Kremenchuk and look at the Amster shopping centre, now there is the Kremash factory, the machine factory, just to the north, which in the past has repaired military vehicles. And I think that was the justification, Russia's justification for launching this attack. So they might say, Russia could say that they used a precision missile and that the shopping centre was within the CEP. Therefore, they could say that the missiles were precise, they landed where they were expected to land, and therefore the civilian deaths were regrettable side effects of engaging, as they see it, a legitimate military target. However, let's have a look at that. We think 2 missiles hit, one just inside the CEP, and one and that hit the shopping centre, and one that landed outside. As I say, the 50% of the missiles can land outside the CEP, and they can land God knows where, a metre, 10 metres, wherever. They just go wherever the system and gravity takes them. So these missiles could well have been precision weapons. They could have done what was expected and still landed on the Amster shopping centre and killed 18 people. And Russia can say, well, it was a legitimate military target and the weapon was precise. However, let's have a look at international humanitarian law. Now, first of all, it says you can't attack civilians. So attacking targets knowing civilians to be in it is illegal. However, attacking legitimate military targets knowing that civilian casualties is likely can be legal, but must be proportionate to the military necessity for carrying out that attack. So, for example, you need to be careful about the weapons you use. If you think there are going to be civilian casualties, then you shouldn't use a massive bomb like a KH-22 missile that's got 1,000 kilograms warhead, travels at almost Mach 5, and like I say, has a CEP of 300 meters. They should have used, if they wanted to attack that target, the Kremash factory, they wanted to attack it, they should have used a much more precise missile that we know they have in their inventory. Having said that, of course, even a much more precise missile, 50% of them will land outside the CEP, so the Amster shopping centre could still have been hit. But let's go back to when it's legal to take civilian life.
So this is about saying, okay, if you think there's going to be civilian casualties, then the weapon you're using needs to be commensurate with your objective. It needs to be proportional. So you need to have really top quality, top important targets to justify using the more imprecise of weapons that are likely to give civilian casualties. And there's an awful lot of wriggle room going on here, and an awful lot is open to interpretation.
Life. So it has to be proportionate to the military necessity, and therefore, if you knowingly use older weapons or those with a much higher CEP, which tend to be older weapons, and therefore the likelihood of hitting civilian targets either because weapons land outside the circular error probable CEP or because they land inside, but it's just such a large area that there's vast amounts of civilian infrastructure in there. That is very, very questionable whether or not that can be considered legal. It would have to be challenged in a court of law in the international court, but it's highly questionable whether or not that is legal. So I'll just the Defence Secretary is literally, he's waving at me now. I'm literally walking into the interview. I need to go, I'm afraid, but I just want people to bear in mind what precision means, what CEP means, and when it comes down to how regrettable as it is, some civilian deaths are legal and some are not. And I've got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to have to go.
Thank you very much, Dom, and we hope your interview with Ben Wallace goes well. Do let us know how that goes in tomorrow's podcast.
That's the first little bit. And then, so that was on June the 29th. And then on July the 4th, a few days later, he says this, just to add to that. And I think this is worth listening to as well.
Do you want to add to that at all?
I would, I'll just say that in response, the Ukrainian Defence Ministry have said that the missiles that were fired in Odessa last night were the same missiles that they say hit the shopping mall the other day, as we saw in the east of the country, and they've said that Russia is a terrorist state, and this is clear evidence that they're a state sponsor of terrorism. As Venetia said, so Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, came back and just said, "I would like to remind you of the."
Just to let you know that now we're in, so this was end of June into July, and this has been going on and on throughout this time. Zaporizhzhia keeps getting hit. This is now at Kyiv in October, and this is exactly the same conversation and the same language being used. It's just a repetition. How have Russia advanced the way they're doing war in this time? No, not at all.
President's words that the Russian armed forces do not work with civilian targets, i.e. do not hit civilian targets. So it just underlines what Venetia was saying. They're just brazen this stuff out. And I think what this shows is that this is all they've got. I mean, extraordinarily debatable as to whether or not they'd ever be able to justify. I mean, so what I'm saying is it's not part of some wider attack. What is the point of firing heavy ordnance like this if it's not part of some wider effort? This is just petulance. It comes the day after the Snake Island retreat, and that was played out widely across the international press, as we covered.
So Snake Island, Russians pulled out there, and as a retaliation for losing Snake Island, they hit back with these kind of indiscriminate missiles, claiming that they did have legitimate targets, but using very imprecise missiles to do so, and sort of asserting a bunch of stuff and hoping that they are sounding genuine. And here again, they've lost the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. They're hitting out, just lashing out with cruise missiles, are imprecise and hitting huge amounts of civilian targets up and down the country
as well. And so this is what you see. This is what Russia can do. All they're able to do is deny that there's Mr. Peskov, and they grind on in the east, and then they chuck heavy ordnance around just because they can. I don't know what the end state is there. They do not have any care for where these things are landing. They're not planning these attacks as part of some wider effort. So it's petulance, and it's all they can do. And as we've mentioned before, if that speaks to what the Russian forces are capable of, i.e. almost no movement at all on the ground, except at very, very high cost, and chuck a lot of air ordnance through the air, then that is not a fully swept up 21st century military. It speaks of a wider weakness. But I won't go on any further there.
Exactly. I mean, if this is all Russia have, then it shows how shoddy they are. Can you imagine the American armed forces doing that now, just indiscriminately hitting? Yes, there are issues with drones taking out collateral, but the precision of drones far outstrips like a CEP of 300 meters for an old KH-22 cruise missile. So it's just, Russia are just not very good at doing war, but they are very good at killing civilians and trying, it seems, to break the spirit of the Ukrainians. But these kind of occasions, these kind of missile usages only galvanize Ukrainian hearts and minds against Russia. They only make people think Russia are more horrible than they were the day before. So it's just poor strategy. But when they don't have the precision missiles, it's all they can do, or at least they feel it's all they can do. I don't know. It just, it annoys me. So going back to the Crimea bridge itself, just looking at this map, the importance of hitting that bridge, you take that out on all these red rail lines are unable to be supplied by Russia, and especially if you take out the other one that was just southeast of Donetsk city, then you are also cutting this whole area off, and that is what happened. So that's what I talked about yesterday. Well, Trent Telenko, who very often talks about logistics, says, and this is a very long thread, I'll try and cut it a bit shorter, but he says the logistical crisis the loss of the Kerch Bridge represents for the Russian military is fuel. Fuel is heavy and bulky, while jets and tanks gulp it up by the ton. The Russians no longer have the railway distribution system to deliver it to jets, tanks and trucks. The most efficient stopgap would be to use rail ferries to deliver cistern cars to Crimea. There are two problems with this. The first is that queuing up of a cistern cars onto a ferry is simply much lower volume compared to the Kerch Bridge. The second is Russian rail ferry service stopped in 2020, and the status of the rail ferries is uncertain. There are tweets claiming the ferries were disposed of since then, so getting those ferries back will take time. The Sevastopol Marine Trade Port, SMTP, transloading complex number 1 has the ability to load and unload complete rail cars. So coastal tanker bulk transfer to cistern rail cars, there is also a possibility with some engineering effort and tankers. Another short-term option is to lay a Russian army tactical pipeline across the remains of the Kerch Bridge to patch a fuel connect between the two rail networks. And there's an article about doing that. The tactical pipeline will be faster than the rail ferry tanker options, but simply won't deliver the same tonnage of fuel into the now isolated Crimea rail network distribution system. A commercial semi-tractor trailer fuel tank shuttle is not an option, as the remaining 2 lanes of the Kerch Bridge has a serious amount of blast damage. Plus, those lanes will be needed at some point to stage heavy cranes to repair the rail bridge. The idea that the Russian army has a tactical fuel trucks to patch the railway fuel distribution gap across the Kerch road bridge lanes is risible. The Feeding the Bear article up the thread makes that clear. So the two major problems with these patchwork repairs is time and fuel volume. Taken together, all of these patchworks together don't provide enough fuel, and they won't all be quick. Russia's current Tsar seems to have chosen the FAFO option, and that means fuck around and find out, option of minor surface repairs and pushing fully laden trains over the heavily fire damaged Kerch Bridge until it collapses under the strain. Reasons. So, the options are not looking good for the Russians. Now let's explain the reasons. Fully laden semi-tanker truck fires in the USA result in interstate highway bridges being condemned, demolished and replaced because the released heat load anneals the steel rebar and causes spalling of the concrete. So what he's saying here is that these are not uncommon in the US, so that you do get exploding fuel tankers that blow up near bridges, and the bridges have to be condemned straight away because that heat is really poor for it. And they have specialist teams that go and fix these bridges. But these specialist teams aren't kicking around Ukraine, right? They aren't kicking around fixing the Kerch Bridge. And he gives examples of when this happens. And he says it's a classic industrial quality trade-off triangle of good, fast, cheap. Pick 2. So you can either do it good and fast, but it won't be cheap. You can do it good and cheap, but it won't be fast. You can do it fast and cheap, but it won't be good. But you can't have all 3, and that's a problem they're going to come across when trying to fix this issue. The toxic waste dump of an economy under Putin's government of thieves simply cannot support such construction firms. There is no free market of precast concrete structures in the Russian economy because the risk of government theft of said structures is too high, and I talked about this in previous videos. They don't have prefabricated concrete structures that they can just whack into place when bridges get blown up, when they need to cross a river, a small river, putting in these prefab concrete pieces and then basically driving over them. They just don't do that. They haven't got that capability. I've detailed this corruption construction problem with the Russian economy back in early April 22 in a couple of threads, and I've read those threads previously, following Trent Telenko, and he's right on the money. So Putin is going the FAFO route, or the FAFO route, with the Kerch railway bridge to restore the fuel flow as soon as possible because he has no other realistic political choice. The problem for Tsar Putin Its politics can't cheat either structural physics or wartime military logistics. Russia's air bases at Crimea are going to run out of fuel at current sortie rates or simply fly less. The Russian fuel supplies past the Donbass border are slowly drying up, immobilizing Russian military vehicle traffic in Ukraine's south. And we're all going to be treated to the spectacle of the Kerch railway bridge collapse in the near future with a loaded train falling into the strait. I've reserved some popcorn waiting to be popped just for that event. And this is why it's so important to follow a range of people on the socials in order to get an idea of not just what's going on militarily, but logistically and economically, and seeing all the intersection of all these disciplines to show that Russia are in trouble. To add to their woes, let's talk about the Susanna here. So the Susanna is this self-propelled gun that has here it is, big picture there, that has a range of 40 kilometers. Not only that, it's self-propelled, so this one's on wheels, which means it can get around pretty easily. Okay, wheels aren't as good as tracks when you're talking about getting stuck in the mud, but so often these guys just pull up on the side of the road and have their pop shots. Either way, it's better than a towed piece of artillery and has much greater range than any of the older Soviet era stuff. So this is the advantage the Ukrainians have, is that they have these are Susannas, they have Caesars from France, they have Panzer Howitzer 2000s from Germany, and they have the Crabs from the AHS Crabs from Poland, and a shed load of them. And these are being used to great effect. Well, it turns out that Germany, Denmark and Norway are to give 16 of these Slovakian Susannas, Susanna 2 howitzers to Ukraine. Germany, Denmark and Norway have agreed to jointly finance the procurement of the Slovakian Susanna 2 guns at a cost of 92 million euros, said the Defence Ministry in Berlin. So this is absolutely fantastic. They will be produced in Slovakia with delivery to Ukraine to begin in 2023. Okay, that's less good, but beginning of 2023, time is going on. Those videos I just showed you were from June, and I was thinking, goodness me, that's months ago. We're now in October, and this thing's still going on. They're still doing the same tactics. So actually, the beginning of next year is still really going to be exceptionally useful. But not only that, Slovakia has delivered to Ukraine 2 more Susanna 2. So this is this week as well. 10th of October, this is today. 2 more of these artillery units, and I have a feeling these were ones that were due maybe to go to Denmark, and they've been kind of redirected to Ukraine, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But these are really useful pieces of kit. Thank you very much to those European nations who are doing that. France have also, because they get slagged off quite a bit for not doing enough, France supplies Ukraine with more Caesar howitzers. So the shipment should consist of 6 to 12 howitzers. So this is from just a week ago, taken from an order intended for Denmark. No, sorry, it's these ones that are intended for Denmark, not the Susannas. An unprecedented operation by Paris, which has been regularly accused of not doing enough. Those are the Caesars, again, self-propelled howitzers. I think these ones have a propensity to get stuck a little more than the Susanna, which are 8 wheels. These have only got 6, and they'll be pretty heavy on the back end. But anyway, you know, really good bits of kit. The Caesars are very useful. Thank you, France. And France, considering again, here's Yukim From saying exactly the same things and talking about how these EU nations and UK and obviously the US are being incredibly important donors or sellers. So not all of it is given. There's a lot of selling going on. And yes, there are probably strings attached. And this is the issue that some people say that Ukraine is going to be tied up to the IMF, to the US, to the EU for decades and decades to come. The flip side is, but what's the alternative? Someone actually used to hang on my blog and had a right pop at me a couple of weeks ago saying, oh, Ukraine's just going to be in the web of power, just having their puppet strings pulled by the West. There is certainly going to be an element of that for the decades going forward. But the question is, but what's the alternative? That Russia literally invade them and destroy them and kill them and torture them. So, again, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? If the world is going to give a bunch of money and armaments to Ukraine, yes, there's an element that, okay, Ukraine are fighting the war that we want fought, so there's an element of giving that stuff, but there's also an element of, okay, we'll give you all this stuff, but you need to do this going forward. You'll need to change the way you do this. Let's put in some anti-corruption measures, or we want a little bit of your natural resources and stuff. So there definitely will be elements of this. There'll be underground deals going on for sure. Anyway, just the last bit I'm going to say is this MRAP. I talked about Turkish MRAP yesterday. Someone called me out on it and said, because I said the Turkish MRAP was notoriously breaks down a little bit more, and he said no, it's way better in the West. And then, you know, it depends who you listen to. There are people that say actually it doesn't have very good off-road capabilities. It breaks down a little more, and the YPG in Syria could blow it up quite easily with RPGs. So anyway, you have these arguments about, oh, my one's better than your one, the Turkish ones are better than, you know, Polish ones. The Polish ones are better than US ones. The US ones are better. Whatever. People argue their case and often argue that their countries are better or not bad. I can tell you the British have supplied a bunch of stuff, and some of our stuff is rubbish, and some of it is good. There's going to be a case of people offloading pretty rubbish bits of kit because they've got nothing else to do with it. No one wants to buy them. They're sat in storage. Let's give them to Ukraine. So Ukraine are getting given an awful lot of stuff. Some of it isn't as fit for purpose as we'd like. Anyway, long and short of it is, here's another MRAP, which is a mine-resistant, ambush personnel carrier. Basically, you drive troops around in these and hope that mines don't blow them up as they drive over them or near them. Well, here's a Russian one, which is actually a decent bit of kit. So this is supposedly a decent MRAP, the Russian one, but here it is taken to bits, and or in certainly worse for wear. And the important part is here, $1 million to replace that new. And Russia is losing equipment hand over fist, and there's just the amount of money this will be costing them in terms of straight away now, but also replacement going forward. So in order to replace their army, replenish their resources and get them back to where they were pre-war, and in fact where people thought they were, because it turns out that their capabilities weren't nearly as good as we were expecting, they're going to have to spend an absolute ton of money. This war is just the worst decision Putin could have made from every direction. Anyway, there you go. There are my nuggets today. Hope that was interesting. Please correct me where I've been wrong. Get your arguments going on down in the threads, and have a look out for the fallout for these missiles that have been sent by the Russians into, well, all over Ukraine, hitting a whole variety of targets, because Russia is giving their harsh response to terrorist attacks by, you know, doing terrorism. Yeah. So thank you. Thanks for all your support. Thanks for checking this out. And until next time, goodbye.